What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at the best Spotlight caches to open in July. First up is Arishem, Marvel Snap's first 7-cost card. He costs 7 and he plays for 7 points, but the real reason people are interested in this guy is because he is one of the cards, like Thanos, like High Evolutionary, that has such a unique and weird effect that it could be game-breaking or it could be absolutely terrible. This is a card that belongs in a class of its own. Thanos, High Evolutionary, Agatha Harkness, these are the only things that are really comparable to it, because what Arishem does is give you 1 extra energy from the start of the game. So your turn 1 will have 2 energy, your turn 2 will have 3 energy, and so on and so forth, but in exchange, he costs you consistency by shuffling in 12 totally random cards, more than a District X is worth, into your deck. So baseline, what Arishem wants us to do, to me, is things that are very unfair when done above the curve. And to me, this takes 2 forms. There are several 5-drops that are just like very unfair when you hit them early. Lady Deathstrike, I think, is a great example where it's just like, oh, if I'm doing that on turn 4, almost nothing else actually matters. That's how good it is. The second direction that you can go to abuse Arishem's extra energy is wave into a big card on turn 2 into the big card on turn 3. That wave will be asymmetrical. It's only discounting your stuff. So you play wave, you play whatever 6-drop, and suddenly you have a 5-power turn 2, a 6-drop on turn 3, and you're very, very, very ahead of the curve. Additionally, when it comes to Arishem, my thought process is that the sort of glue of the deck is going to be cards like Loki or Agent Coulson, things of that nature. Maybe a Quinjet, which seems like a natural inclusion, but I do wonder if you don't want to overload on Energy Cheat. I'm not exactly sure. So when I think about building an Arishem deck, what I think about is a deck with the snap profile of like a Pixie deck, basically, where you just like have these games where you like wave Magneto 2-3, and that's like the most broken thing on earth. Or you like Lady Deathstrike your opponent's entire lane on turn 4, and it's like the most broken thing on earth, right? And so the rest of the time, you're going to be cobbling together a game plan with cards like Agent Coulson, with cards like Loki, with the random cards that you're generating. Maybe we're even playing Nick Fury in here. And so you end up in a situation where the deck, I can believe, is something that makes sense, but also it is the kind of deck that is never going to be able to interact with its opponent in a really profitable way, which is to say a lot of the interaction that you're going to put in your deck, you're just not going to draw. You can't really reliably be a Shang-Chi deck because you have 24 cards. You're not going to like actually see any of it. The other direction you could go is just run all the tech and be like, I'm drawing something and they won't expect it. Maybe that works too. I'm not entirely sure. What I know is I'm buying this card. But a lot of that is, I'm a content creator. I can't not buy the most hype card they've made in like a year. This is going to be something that's going to take a lot of time to figure out. It's going to be something that's worth experimenting with, and it is incredibly exciting. But I can't guarantee that it's going to be incredibly strong or anything like that. It's certainly, for me, the most intriguing of these, but it's also the hardest to rate on power. I can believe that Arishem ends up either extremely busted or not good at all. I sort of look at him like an NBA draft pick that has a high ceiling and a very low floor. That's Arishem right here. If you're interested in risking it for the biscuit, I think that might make sense. But if you're not that interested, always wait until the last day before you make any decisions on your caches, especially with a card this weird. I cannot imagine it was possible to playtest this card. I'm going to be 100% real with you, because how do you ever playtest something with this amount of randomness in it? So this is a card where I think that it is the card that is coming out that is the closest or the likeliest to be a mistake, but also one that I think could end up being unplayable. The range really is from Agatha to OG Thanos on this guy. And so you're going to want to take your time and make sure he's what you want before you spend your caches. I, on the other hand, am getting him day 1. Alongside Arishem in his cache is the newly buffed Hercules, who actually is a good card right now. If you are going to play move, you want Hercules. That is not a joke. He is your force multiplier in your move decks. He's what enables you to get to these ridiculously large numbers. He's a very good card in the move archetype such as it is right now. I would argue that he's almost like the Shuri of that archetype, where it's like, this went from a card that is not nearly core to a card that is absolutely core in move. He's not really going to do anything other than that, though. This is a card that has a well-defined role as a move enabler and doesn't really tend to go outside of that space in any real way. This is not something where you're like, Hercules, Professor X, that's not a thing. As far as I'm aware, that's not a thing. You are playing this with Dagger, you are playing this with Human Torch, you are playing this with Vulture. That's the thing. Black Swan is a very, very mediocre card. She has never seen consistent top-level play. She has almost never made it to one of my tier lists, and in any deck that did make it to a tier list, she was pretty much always the 12th card in it, or in the case of Thanos, sometimes the 18th card in it. This is not a card that is worth opening caches for. There are things you can do with her, and I do think she maybe has some, like, untapped combo potential, but she is the card I think of when people say, oh, just slap a 3/5 stat line on anything and it's good. This is the counter example. Black Swan is a card that I wouldn't be shocked if it ended up being plausible at some point, but it hasn't happened yet, and that might just be cope, right? It's one of those cards where people are like, this will only get better as the game goes on, and I don't think that's ever actually happened to any of those cards unless they got buffed, right? Grandmaster got 2 power. The people that said he would be better as the game went on at 2-0 were not right. He needed that 2 power to be better. The same goes for something like Absorbing Man, which is sort of like the patient zero of people saying like, oh, well, it'll get better because there's just more synergy coming out. That's just how it works. I don't believe that happened either, because Absorbing Man released at a 4-3 and now is a 4-4 and previously was a 4-5. Also needed those points of power. So when you look at a card like this, I just don't think you can realistically say, okay, yeah, it's never been good, but it will be in the future based on several question marks. I don't think you can do that. This is not worth opening caches for. The week after Arishem, Hydra Bob drops, and Hydra Bob is a very unique card. As far as I'm aware, the first card in Marvel Snap to ever integrate with the snapping mechanic. Hydra Bob, at the end of every turn, will move if a player snapped that turn. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating numbers on this card. First of all, 1/4, very big for a very small amount. I don't know if 1/4 is enough to be just like generically good on a vanilla. I do know if there was like a 1/5 vanilla, it would be awesome, amazing, one of the best cards there is. 1/4, I don't know. Because I think there's a lot of decks right now that are doing stuff that are looking like, okay, here's what's going to happen, right? I am going to, win one lane with a Shang-Chi, and then I just need like something with points to go in another lane. I lost today, for example, to a clog deck playing Shang-Chi and Titania. And granted, Titania is doing double duty in that deck. She's also clogging your opponent, but is that kind of deck interested in a 1/4? And how does the snapping factor in? I think that this is probably going to be the most either fascinating or frustrating card in the entirety of the game, because the snap mechanic stake raising bit will encourage a lot of like, oh, I'm supposed to snap here, and if I do, I can win, but also if they snap me back, it's like a boomer snap card, right? Like, this is a card that incentivizes weird boomer snaps almost, or like early snaps to try to clog up a lane or something. Just a bunch of weird stuff that I've never had to think about in a game like Marvel Snap. Personally, I am someone whose weakest aspect is snapping. I'm a very good card game player. I'm not a great snapper. And so this card adding an additional mechanic onto that, I'm a little worried I might not be good at playing him or really get him the same way someone who is better at snapping and understanding the risk reward and worse at card games might get more out of it than me. The interesting thing, though, is that it fuses that. It's moving in the game in response to the snap mechanic. I am excited for what this means for design space. My instinct is this guy needs one more point of power before he's super busted, but he might be realistically very playable at just 1/4 with this ability. I think if he was a 1/5, I'd be saying this is a busted card or a very good card. At 1/4, I'm a little more skeptical, but a lot of that skepticism is just I haven't played any, and I don't know how that snapping stuff is going to impact how he feels to play. Alongside Hydra Bob in the cache is probably a better 1-drop, Nebula. Nebula is an absolute all-star of a card, just like the perfect example when I think of a 4 out of 5-star card, an archetype stalwart, phenomenal across the board in a variety of decks. The only card that does what she does in a reasonable way is Nebula. There are no good replacements for what she can offer a deck. She is an excellent card in almost every lockdown strategy, and that gives her a very well-defined niche because there are basically 0 other 1-drops that have that distinction. She is an absolute staple in a variety of decks. She's not going to super carry you in everything. She's not Jeff, she's not Nocturne, she doesn't go in everything, she doesn't have that kind of wide-ranging playability, but she is a very specific archetype all-star. Just a good to great card that does what you need it to do in a variety of similarly styled but differently constructed clog and or lockdown shells. A good card. Galactus is sort of the opposite. He's like a 2 out of 5-star build-around card where he's not really ever that good. I can't remember the last time there was a legit Galactus deck with like 50+% win rate. And he's very much a card for people who like doing a specific thing. One thing that I saw recently that I thought was very insightful from Gnome Plays was that there is a subset of Marvel Snap players who are really in it for the deterministic wins, whose favorite thing is knowing that they're going to win the game. And to some degree, that holds them back because it restricts their deck choice to stuff like this and, you know, Professor X decks. And there's a certain subset of people, Professor X, Alioth, Galactus, where the thing that drives them is not exposing themselves to risk and setting up a combo that cannot be beaten. They love that feeling. And if you love that feeling, I do think Galactus could be a card for you, but if you are trying to win games of Marvel Snap, I do not expect Galactus to be a worthwhile investment. First of all, he's not very good right now. Second of all, I think that the design team has a very heavy eye on this guy. This is a card that they don't ever seem to want to be really good, because once he is really good, he ends up being one of the most frustrating cards, one of the most frustrating experiences in the game. For the same reason, like we talk about how much people like, you know, oh, I have this deterministic win. Well, you know what sucks is having a deterministic loss. So it's very one-sided fun. It's fun only for the person doing it and not for the other person that it's happening to. And cards with this sort of profile, Alioth, Professor X, Galactus twice before, tend to get a stronger look from the development team because they are such an awkward, awful thing to deal with. And so when you have a card like that has a history of getting nerfed when it's good, currently kind of sucks, it's kind of hard to recommend you open for it. Ajax, recently secretly nerfed in an OTA, is a 5/5 now. When he was originally data mined, he was a 4/4. I think that at 4/4 with this ability, this card was going to be extremely powerful. This is an ability that scales based on how many of your opponent's cards are afflicted with -1 power. When I saw that 4/4 Ajax, my head immediately went to some sort of debris Mockingbird hazmat deck that just uses this card as the biggest guy of all time. And so you end up in these situations where, like, yes, okay, you get Luke Caged, he kind of sucks. I get it. But if you are able to have a clog sub-theme alongside the tried and true strategy of playing a bunch of big idiots for a lot less than a big idiot should cost, you're going to end up in a good spot. The issue with Ajax now is that he is not much less than a big idiot should cost. He ends up looking like worse Gilgamesh. And granted, it's probably easier to hazmat stuff than it is to Blue Marvel stuff. There's a lot more things happening on rails when you're the Gilgamesh deck, right? Like, you have to go Blue Marvel on 5. It has to happen that way. You have no flexibility about it because Gilgamesh is on reveal and not ongoing, right? There's upsides and downsides, but fundamentally, my worry with Ajax is that the body, when you do get Luke Cage, just isn't enough at 5 cost. I would honestly look at this card and say, it should be like a 4. If you're going to bring it back to 4, maybe bring it back to 4/2 or something, or make it like a 5/9. Like, make it actually comparable to Gilgamesh. Because of the way it looks like it works, it's just like, this could be a really big, super awesome payoff for the Hazmat deck. But at 5/5? I just don't think it's going to do much at 5/5. I'm just going to be completely honest with you. I was really excited for this at 4/4. I am not nearly as excited for this at 5/5. 5 is a hard cost to make work. Like, it doesn't seem like the world's biggest jump to a lot of people, but I think that this is like a very meaningful nerf. And it took me from thinking this card was like one of the best in the season to this card is not very good at all. And I mean, on the one hand, I'm grateful because, you know, I'm thinking this card is one of the best in the season. Then they nerf it. And it's like, okay, so I was right about that. But on the other hand, I feel like they nerfed it maybe a little bit too much. And I'd really like to see this guy at like 5'8", 5'9" with an ability like this, so he's more directly comparable to Gilgamesh, as opposed to 5'5", which I think is just... I don't like it. I don't like it at 5'5". I just don't. One upside to Ajax, though, is that his cache contains some genuinely useful cards. Darkhawk is a card that is already just quite good. Darkhawk and Rocks have been a tried and true combination for an extended period of time in Marvel Snap's lifespan. And I know everyone got mad when 4-0 Darkhawk moved to 5-4 Darkhawk, but that was a buff. So good that they had to nerf it again. Now it's a 5-3. And I think more importantly, Darkhawk is gonna be quite good if Arishem is. And that seems like that's a very obvious, straightforward thing, right? If they start with 24 cards in the deck, they're going to end with, like, you know, 15 cards in the deck. And it's like, oh, okay, I guess I'm just going to play this largest guy of all time. He's just going to be like 34 power. And it's like, oh, well, that means you lose, Mr. Arishem Gamer. And if anything holds Arishem back, it is going to be this. But if Arishem does succeed on a high level, I would expect a lot of people to be picking up this cache because Darkhawk is the easiest and most obvious way to deal with him. Darkhawk Mystique, I don't see how you ever lose to Arishem. That's just a 534 and then like a 330. Like, yeah, you probably just win. Sorry, a 533. My bad. I'm sure that 1 point of power will be incredibly impactful. Beta Ray Bill is the other card in this cache, and like, I think it is clearly the best cache we've talked about so far, on the strength of Darkhawk and on the strength of Beta Ray Bill. Beta Ray Bill is a little bit like Nebula. I would say maybe a 3.5 out of 5 to Nebula's 4 out of 5, where Nebula goes in more stuff, but Beta Ray Bill is genuinely irreplaceable in any deck that runs Beta Ray Bill. He's the only card that does what he does, which is be a second Thor. I realize there's a little bit of irony in that. I'm like, oh, he's the only card that does what he does is second Thor. Obviously, Thor does what he does. You always run them together. There is not a deck that is playing Thor and that is playing just Beta Ray Bill and is not playing Thor. These guys go together. Beta Ray Bill, Thor, Jane Foster. That's a package. You can complete that package by picking up Beta Ray Bill. His decks sort of vary. They're either these very high-end, like, combo decks, so you run him in Wong and just do something really stupid. You can try, like, Pixie stuff with this shell as well. But the one that is the most common is just sort of playing it as Sarah-less Sarah, where your goal is to just go, you know, Thor, Beta Ray Bill, Jane Foster, final turn, play hammers, play tech cards, win game. That's kind of the idea behind the most common of Beta Ray Bill decks. So if you're interested in that, he's definitely a card worth picking up if you want to play that playstyle, because it is absolutely gated off from you without him. And I think that is one of the things that makes this cache so good, is like, A, there's no super whiffs, except maybe Ajax. We'll see about it, because like, I feel like that card is missing some power, honestly. Like, I don't really get it where they're at with 5-5. At 4-4, this was my favorite cache by far. Like, we had a card I liked in Ajax that I thought was very good. We had Darkhawk, which is going to be good against Arishem. We had Beta Ray Bill, who's a very good card. As is, it's still my favorite cache we've talked about so far, but we'll have to reevaluate at the end of the video. Next up is Copycat, a card I think is alternately getting overrated and underrated. A 3/5 with the ability that says, when you draw this, steal the text from the card on the bottom of your opponent's deck. Now, let's start with what isn't good about this card. Stealing text doesn't matter. This could be copy the text. It doesn't matter. That's the bottom card of the deck. It's not going to really matter that much. Unless you're playing Mill, in which case, go off, I guess. It's a more playable deck than it has been. Maybe it matters, maybe it doesn't. Who knows? Here's what's good about this card. This is a 3/5. Like, I realize that it's just like kind of like a cheat code for making a card be worth investigating, but if you can turn this into like a 3/5 with upside, that is premium. Like, that is like, oh, okay, I got a 3/5. It copied my opponent's Doctor Doom. The game ended. I got to snap it. They don't know why. Like, what really sticks out to me about this card as being good is that you see it in your hand. When you draw the card, it happens. They lose the ability. First of all, do they know they lose the ability? That's crazy. Second of all, what if they don't know they lose the ability and then we shuffle stuff in their deck and then they draw the card with no ability? Like, there's a lot going on here that makes me excited about this card. One thing that I think is getting overrated about it is people are like, oh my god, steel text. That doesn't matter. We've had a cable that was I believe it was a 2/2 or a 2/3, drew the bottom card of your opponent's deck, and it was awful. Totally irrelevant, because the bottom card of your opponent's deck is not a card they are going to be seeing anyway. You have to go out of your way to make that true. And so when you are affecting the bottom card of your opponent's deck, it's something that people think matters a lot more than it actually does. There's some information advantage built into this, but really what's going on here is you get all of this stuff for free on a 3/5 body. If this was a 3/4, I'm not sure she'd be worth considering. But since she's at such a premium stat line, you end up feeling like it's sort of like Nocturne, right? Where it's like, you would do this if it was just move, right? Like, you would play that in a lot of stuff just for being a 3/5, right? This is one of those cards where it's like the downside is so negligible and the upside is so high that I find it hard to believe she doesn't end up competing with Nocturne Red Guardian for that like best 3-drop slot. Just a really strong looking card to me. Of course, the other possibility is she ends up more like Baron Zemo, right? Where it's like this very specific kind of card. The thing about this card is it's going to depend a lot on what's in the metagame. If you are playing a lot of like mid-rangey mirrors where your card's text matters a lot, she's going to be great. If you're playing a lot of like combo stuff, this card's not doing much against something like Living Tribunal or Hela. It's just not really built for that. Like, it's going to be maybe okay if you like know for a fact that the best card in their deck is on the bottom, but like, it's kind of a card that's like, this is going to sound offensive, right? It's a little bit like Morph, where when Morph is good, when we're in a meta that's good for Morph, they're like the most broken card in the game. Like, in the Ravona mirrors, like, so often a Morph on 4 or 5 is Iron Man or Sasquatch or Sage or whatever big stuff is in their hand, because that's what's in their hand at the time. And this is going to be sort of like that, where it's like, in situations where this matters, it's going to matter a lot. And then in situations where it doesn't, it's going to be like, okay, I mean, it's a 3/5, right? How bad can that possibly be? But we've had Black Swan, we've had Baron Zemo. 3/5s can actually be bad still. Like, I just think that like this is going to be between that range and the Red Guardian Nocturne range, and competing with the top of that range is sort of where I expect it to be, but it's definitely possible it ends up below that. Copycat's cache is also quite nice. She comes alongside Thanos. Thanos is usually a card that's worth picking up if you don't have him. I don't have a lot of belief in Thanos decks generally. I think of them as like C+, B- decks. You can play them, there's usually better options, but they're far from unplayable. Thanos is okay, but it's also a card that feels like it's in the process of like being iterated upon. It's usually useful to have those cards, because if you're talking about like cards that have a chance of getting buffed, I do think Thanos is like one of the likely contenders here. I'm also interested to see what ends up happening with this card in the future. And the other card in the cache is actually a pretty good Thanos card itself. That other card being Cull Obsidian, a 4/10. And Cull Obsidian actually just has a lot of homes right now. It's not just in Thanos. This is a card that is going in any deck that is looking to like get off a good scar, basically. And there are decks like that. The Deathbird deck has sort of cut out the mid-range stuff and is now just very much about, I want to play Cull Obsidian, I want to play Sasquatch, I want to play Mockingbird, I want to play Death, I want to play Scar, I want to play a bunch of big guys. That's what I'm doing now, and Cull Obsidian is an important part of that. I don't think I would ever see that deck cutting Cull Obsidian. That seems very unlikely to me. And so that deck ends up really being interested in this card. Thanos ends up typically being very interested in this card. Cull Obsidian is in a large amount of Thanos decks as well. And so I actually think he's also a pretty good pickup if you have the chance to do it. Finally, there's a bit of a weird week at the end of July and the beginning of August. As far as we are aware right now, Cassandra Nova will be the card that ends up as the reward of Deadpool's Diner. This means that she will not be in Spotlight caches. Currently, there are 2 cards data mined for her cache, but I don't really trust that they're going to stay that way. Like, these were the cards that were in it before they decided to make this the reward for Deadpool's Diner. So I'm not going to talk about that week in the Spotlight Cache context. I do apologize for that, but I think it would just be reckless speculation to talk about a week where we have 2 data mined cards. There could be a 3rd one. We don't know what it's going to be. We don't know if those 2 cards are going to be in it or not. So we're not going to talk about that, and we are going to talk about Cassandra Nova. Now, Cassandra Nova looks like a card, to me, like, one of my worries about the Deadpool's Diner system is that if you're second dinner, you're kind of a little bit incentivized to be like, all right, let's put bad cards in the Deadpool's Diner system. Let's they're getting this card for free. We can't make it that good. Cassandra Nova looks like good. Like, this card looks good. This is a 3/7 if you play it on turn 3, and it's draining 1 power from everything your opponent does. Like, on turn 3, this is going to be one of the most oppressive cards in the game. Just a wild thing. And I think that when we talk about, like, what to do to counter it, there's Cassandra Nova in the meta, there's Ajax in the meta. Yeah, there's probably going to be a lot of Luke Cage, but Luke Cage doesn't protect your deck. Luke Cage isn't protecting the deck in this situation. I honestly think Cassandra Nova is quite powerful. I'm very excited that this is one of the cards that they're giving away for free, or, you know, whatever you want to define free-to-play grindable as, right? This is a strong card. I don't know if it will find a home necessarily. If it does, I would expect it to be in like some sort of rock, Darkhawk, Ravonna type thing. The fact that it is a 3/1 actually kind of wigs me out, because if this works with Ravonna, like, we might have a little bit of a problem. Like, there's got to be something stupid we can do with this. Mystique also works with Ravonna in our little bit of a Darkhawk deck, right? Like, we're trying to beat Arishem type stuff. This is a card that absolutely mollywops Arishem. Like, between this and Darkhawk, everyone's going to have the tools they need to deal with that. I do expect that. And this is she's just strong. Like, maybe oppressively so. It takes a lot for a 3-drop to catch my eye, but, like, this is, whoa. This is like a Sage that you play early. Like, that's what she is. And that is kind of crazy to me. All right, y'all, thank you so much for checking out this video. I feel like it ran a bit long, but I don't actually have a good context for it. Like, it might have been a bit long, I don't know. But I really did enjoy making it, and let me know if you want more videos like this in the future. I need to get back to doing things like, you know, tier lists and all of that, like rating cards in terms of purchasability, more non-Dex content. So please let me know what you'd like to see from the channel. If you have like specific video ideas that aren't just like, hey, I'm doing well with this deck, I'd love to hear them. As always, thank you so much. I've been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Let me know what you think of the caches as well, and I will see you in the next one.